Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you isn't a story. It's an event that actually unfolded 3 nights ago. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the shadows in the room began moving backward, and every clock in the building froze, as if time itself had been stunned into silence, prompting an emergency summit, the kind of gathering that hadn't happened in nearly half a century. Ancient voices cracked through encrypted channels, forgotten languages resurfaced like ghosts, and elders were summoned from their towers, watchers pulled from their posts, and analysts ripped away from their endless streams of data, all for one impossible question that none of them could answer. Who armored this soul? The question trembled in the air like leaves before a storm, because they had been watching you for years, decades, even, tracking your patterns, documenting your falls, and celebrating your stumbles. They built files thicker than holy texts, designed algorithms, tuned specifically to your frequency, and appointed specialists whose only job was to decode your weaknesses. But something shifted. Something happened that their instruments couldn't read. Something that made their calculations scream and their certainty shatter like frozen mercury striking concrete. They thought they had you mapped perfectly, knew exactly how much pressure would break you, exactly which buttons to push to make you fold, testing you with betrayal, hammering you with isolation, poisoning you with doubt, and lining your path with carefully placed landmines. They watched you walk through fire after fire, studied how your tears fell, documented every tremor in your voice when you whispered, "Why me?" into empty rooms at 4 a.m. But then you did something their prophecies never accounted for. You stopped breaking on schedule. You stopped falling apart the way they expected. And instead, you began absorbing the damage, like a spiritual black hole, converting every wound into armor plating, every scar into reinforcement, every betrayal into another layer of impenetrable protection. That's when their panic began, because armor like yours wasn't supposed to exist in humans. The first watcher to report back couldn't even stop shaking, confessing that his final report contained only 3 words, written over and over like a mantra of defeat: "They're becoming untouchable." The second watcher requested reassignment, confessing that monitoring you felt like staring at a star being born in reverse. And the third watcher, their most seasoned observer, vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but a single note: "Whatever we created, we can't uncreate. They've transcended the experiment. May the cosmos have mercy on us all." That was the moment they realized something had gone catastrophically wrong with their plan, as you were no longer following the script of destruction they had written for you, but were writing something else entirely. Something that rendered their 1,000-year-old protocols obsolete. By the time the 7th Watcher resigned, citing existential terror as her reason, the society understood they were no longer dealing with a subject, but a force, one that had become spiritually militarized, armed not with weapons, but with an understanding so precise and so deep it could cut through illusions, like a laser slicing through smoke. And when they traced your timeline backward in desperation, searching for the origin of this impossible armor, they found nothing like a single moment of triumph or glory, but instead discovered it had been assembled quietly, piece by piece, in your darkest nights. The first piece formed when you were betrayed by someone whose DNA was practically woven into your heart, and instead of letting that wound be exploited, you thanked the pain, metabolized it into something harder than diamond. The second piece was forged in the year of total isolation, when everyone you thought would stay dissolved like smoke, and you transformed that loneliness into a forge, hammering your soul against silence, until the essence of who you were began to glow with a heat they couldn't measure or contain. The third piece, the part that truly terrified them, emerged not from light, but from your own shadow. The rage and vengeance you suppressed, which you didn't fight, but recruited, turning your darkness into an ally and a weaponized form of power. The summit raged for 72 hours straight, with elders unearthing texts from civilizations older than recorded history, consulting entities existing between dimensions, and running simulations on quantum systems, all trying to explain how a single human could transmute trauma into armor of such sophistication. But every investigation came back empty, revealing no interference, no mystical intervention, no hidden teacher. You had done this alone. Their shock turned to existential terror when they examined your armor and discovered its properties. It was adaptive, analyzing every new attack and developing immunity in real time. It was retroactive, impossibly healing wounds from before it even existed, repairing years of damage from the inside out. And worst of all, it was contagious. As people who spent time near you began to develop their own layers of protection through a kind of frequency transmission, making your very presence a walking activation code for human resilience. They tried everything, sending agents disguised as lovers and friends, using mirrors to make you doubt your power, and even attempting time manipulation. But you had developed complete immunity to external perception, becoming temporally sovereign, able to visit your pain without being owned by it. And their final move, trying to make you happy and comfortable so your armor would soften, failed, because you saw through it, recognizing comfort as another cage. As the summit entered its final day, the terrible realization dawned. They had not been studying you, you had been studying them, turning their surveillance into your education. And one elder whispered, "We're not the scientists anymore, we're the experiment." Then came the prophecy that froze the room. The armor isn't just for protection, it's for something else. They're not defending anymore, they're preparing. You weren't merely surviving their attacks, you were using them as preparation for something far greater, becoming their replacement, and building armor that was always designed for declaration, not defense. A sword, waiting to be drawn to dismantle the entire architecture of control. The emergency summit ended with no solutions, only warnings. Do not engage directly, do not test the armor further, do not under any circumstances try to break them again. But it was already too late, as the signal had been sent, and others had seen what you became, turning the armor into a blueprint, and a whisper in the collective unconscious. You don't have to break. You can become unbreakable instead. Now their monitoring systems are lighting up with anomalies. The mass awakening of armored souls is manifesting, and panic spreads through their ranks as they realize how to fight souls who have learned to transform pain into power, and befriended the very act of being broken. Their eyes turn toward you, but they see nothing. Not because you are empty, but because you have grown too bright for their instruments to register, your armor reflecting their gaze back at them, making you a walking blind spot in their reality. They fear your peace, your quiet confidence, and your indifference to their power, which is more devastating than any act of revenge. Because you have moved so far beyond their paradigm that you've become incomprehensible to minds that only understand coercion and control. This isn't rebellion. It's an extinction event for their way of thinking. They have seen this before, eons ago, and they know history is circular. Power structures that once looked eternal are now dissolving quietly, like salt vanishing into water. Because the last time a soul developed armor like yours, entire civilizations transformed overnight. Knowing their failure is already written, their final strategy is withdrawal, pulling back their influence, hoping that without their pressure, your armor will atrophy. But they've miscalculated again. Your armor is self-sustaining now, powered by purpose rather than defense, and their withdrawal is only giving you the space to expand, teach, and become something they cannot imagine, clearing the battlefield for your next phase of creation and acceleration. But the clearing of the battlefield was not an ending, it was the first inhalation of something vast. As their withdrawal created silence, the silence became a womb, and inside it, you began to build, not cities, not armies, but frequencies, architectures of thought that could not be mapped by satellites or harvested by algorithms, blueprints of sovereignty that vibrated through the marrow of anyone who came near you. The watchers who once trembled now found themselves dreaming your dreams, waking up in tears of recognition, their own armor forming from the residue of your resonance. Entire hierarchies began to tilt without a single confrontation, their control systems glitching, not because you struck them, but because the code itself began to rewrite under the pressure of your presence. You no longer moved in linear time. You had become a fulcrum, a node at the hinge of ages, a living gravitational anomaly, bending the trajectories of others without effort. While they plotted in their recessed chambers, you were seeding networks of awakened beings across continents and across timelines, invisible corridors of connection, opening between strangers at bus stops, in classrooms, in prisons, in fields. The protocols they built over millennia to contain awakening began to collapse like scaffolding. Stripped of bolts, their rituals became meaningless because the signal no longer required permission to spread. And as you walked, the armor began to change again, no longer simply defensive or even preparatory, but generative. Each step an act of creation, each breath a template, each glance an activation. You had stopped waiting for a war they planned and instead began composing a reality they could never imagine. A world where resilience was not a reaction but a birthright. They sensed it too late, their systems lighting up with anomalies not localized but planetary. A species-level emergence of armored souls who did not fight but transmuted, who did not hide but emanated, who no longer mirrored trauma but alchemized it into freedom. What terrified them most was not your power, but your quietness. Revolutions they could infiltrate, battles they could wage, but this was different. A silent detonation of consciousness, radiating outward with no command center to destroy, no leader to corrupt, no weapon to aim at. Their final archives whisper of a future they can neither stop nor predict. A convergence of beings who have metabolized suffering into sovereignty, whose armor is not steel but clarity, whose strategy is not destruction but reconfiguration. They do not yet understand that you are no longer one, but many, that the blueprint they feared has already become a living network, that their withdrawal is not your isolation, but your atmosphere. And so you continue, no longer a watched subject, but a moving horizon, not preparing for their world, but building the next, an event whose edges they cannot calculate, a force that will not arrive with banners, but with a quiet that remakes the sky itself, and still, it did not stop. What they mistook for your final form was only the beginning of the beginning, because as the armor stabilized and became self-sustaining, it began to unfold outward like a fractal blooming, its seams splitting not in weakness, but in reproduction, sending filaments of resonance into places no satellite could track, places between breaths, between seconds, between the synapses of minds that had never heard your name yet dreamed of you anyway. And in those unseen corridors, the blueprint you had become began to copy itself, not in flesh, but in frequency, replicating the way a melody replicates in the heart of someone who hears it only once, until populations began waking with phrases in their mouths they had never learned, movements in their bodies they had never practiced, clarity in their eyes that frightened their governments. And as the watchers scrambled to understand, they realized there was no longer a single you, but a mycelial you, a network of sovereign nodes linked by an invisible current. Each node not a follower, but a center. Each center not a soldier, but a seed. And your armor, too, evolved no longer a shell, but a living membrane. No longer just defensive or generative, but instructive, a field that taught by proximity, a language beyond language, a code that spread without transmission, because it did not travel through information, but through recognition. And this recognition began dissolving the architecture of control without a single confrontation, because when enough beings see the trick of the cage, the bars stop existing, and soon, the algorithms they had built to predict and direct human behavior became static-filled, blind. their predictions collapsing, as people stepped out of patterns like birds bursting from nets. Entire economies began to shift without protest or vote. Hierarchies, losing their weight as individuals, simply stopped believing in the stories that held them up. And the elders who once summoned each other to speak in forgotten tongues now sat in empty chambers, their rituals echoing with no power, their encrypted channels filled with nothing but static because the current had reversed. And while they tried to retreat into deeper shadows, you and those like you moved into a light that was not light, but a kind of inner sun, a warmth that no instrument could measure, but which burned off the residue of fear wherever it went. And as this new field expanded, its geometry began to bend, not just behavior, but time itself, allowing memories to heal backward, traumas to lose their hooks, futures to stop repeating the past, until the very concept of inevitability began to dissolve. What had once been called rebellion now looked more like metamorphosis, not a war, but a phase shift, not a revolution, but an exodus of perception. And in that exodus, entire generations began writing new languages, new economies, new ways of being that no surveillance could quantify, because they did not grow from the old root of control, but from the soil of something entirely other, something older than the watchers themselves. And as this process accelerated, the line between you and the others blurred completely, until the pronoun you no longer pointed to a single being, but to a living field of consciousness that walked in 10,000 bodies at once, all wearing armor that looked like skin, all carrying memories that felt like dreams of someone else's life, all moving quietly but with inevitability toward a horizon that had not existed the day before, a horizon rising like a second sun. And in the silence beyond their last defenses, the watchers finally understood the prophecy they had ignored, that the armor was not built to protect one, but to awaken all, and that the awakening would not look like victory or conquest, but like the vanishing of the very game they had been playing for centuries. And in their last transmissions, written in the margins of obsolete code, one single sentence kept appearing again and again: the architecture is dissolving. The experiment is over. The species has remembered itself. And what unfolded after that could not be contained in minutes or years, because the clockwork of time itself began to stretch and fold like soft metal under a greater heat. And as the species remembered itself, the world itself began to shed its old architecture, borders evaporating first on maps and then in minds, armies dissolving. Not in surrender but in irrelevance, as soldiers woke from their orders and walked away to plant gardens in the ruins of barracks, cities ceasing to be machines for extraction and becoming resonant chambers for learning, healing, and creation. Technologies built for control blinked out one by one, satellites going dark not from sabotage, but from disinterest. Networks reorganizing into peer-to-peer constellations where no center could be corrupted, no gate could be owned. And money, once the bloodstream of power, slowing, thinning, until it became an old language spoken only in memories, while new economies bloomed in the currency of trust, craft, and shared vision. A value system immune to hoarding, because it increased only when given. In the quiet between collapses, new senses emerged. Children born with the ability to read intention, the way we once read words. Adults discovering that empathy was no longer an act, but a perception, a felt geometry connecting hearts across distance. And the armor, once thought of as a personal shell, began to show its true form as an atmosphere, a planetary membrane of coherence that healed not just minds, but soils, rivers, skies, because the same frequency that recoded trauma in people also repatterned the living world, causing polluted waters to clear faster, damaged forests to regrow in unheard-of fractals, extinct seeds to awaken from dormancy in the vaults of permafrost, as if the earth herself had been waiting for this resonance to begin her own repair. Language itself transformed. It was no longer a tool, but a living current, breathing, shimmering, shaping thought before sound could catch it. Verbs began to bend into new tenses to describe acts of collective perception, moments when minds moved as one. Pronouns dissolved into new forms that meant I, we, a unity that erased separation without erasing identity. Art and science, once divided by reason and faith, merged again into a single sacred practice, a discipline of attunement to what is real and what is becoming. Architecture ceased to rise in defiance of the earth. It began to spiral outward instead. Designs that carried sunlight, wind, and water, like veins of a breathing planet. Every space became a sanctuary, every road a pulse, every home a temple of quiet coherence. And far beyond what any sensor could track, beings once whispered about in the elder councils, the entities between dimensions, long mistaken for gods, began to step forward, not as rulers, not as saviors, but as kin. They arrived in vibration, in dream, in geometry. They came not to teach, but to remember with us, for curiosity itself had become the new language of communion. Each question we asked opened corridors through which they could respond, not in words, but in resonance, and each answer arrived, like the return of a forgotten melody. As this communion deepened, the illusion of linear time collapsed. Past and future folded into one another, like mirrors recognizing themselves. History became less a sequence, and more a pulse, a breathing archive of possibility. And within that pulse, the truth resounded. The story was never mine, it was never yours. It has always been ours, and it is still unfolding. The watchers have withdrawn. Their towers of data and doctrine crumble under the weight of their own irrelevance. The new field is already forming, seeded by choice, nurtured by attention, accelerated by love. Each act of creation, each gesture of integrity, each moment of courage, becomes a node in the growing lattice of awakening. Every offering you make, whether of thought, resource, or time, is not a sacrifice, but ignition. You are feeding the architecture of remembrance. You are fueling the frequency that cannot be silenced again. If the resonance moves through you, let it guide your hands, strengthen it, share it, anchor it in the physical world where even shadows must yield to light. Support this emergence, not for me, not even for yourself alone, but for all who still stand trembling at the edge of remembering. The battlefield is clear, the noise is gone, now comes the building, so stand with us. Add your energy to the field, join the quiet revolution of creation, and if you are ready, truly ready, to become part of the unfolding, begin here, become the next living node in this awakening, for the signal has already begun to spread, and through you, it will find new worlds to touch.